London, 1266. A baker is lashed to a wooden hurdle, a crude sled used for dragging criminals. Rotten loaves hang from his neck like a necklace of shame. The crowd parts as horses begin to pull. The hurdle lurches forward. His body scrapes across cobblestones slick with sewage and animal waste. The streets of medieval London weren't paved. They were open cesspits. Citizens pour from doorways and workshops. They know this baker, they've bought his bread, and now they know what was in it. Chalk dust, sawdust, ground peas, anything to stretch the flour and skim a profit. A woman hurls a loaf at his face. It strikes with a wet thud. The bread is weeks old, crawling with mold. Others follow. His own fraudulent products become projectiles of public rage. This wasn't cruelty. This was the Assize of Bread, King Henry III's answer to an epidemic of poisoning. London's bakers had been slowly killing their customers, and the Crown had finally noticed. For decades, bakers had been adulterating flour with whatever white powder they could find. Chalk dust made bread look whiter, more prestigious. Sawdust added bulk. But these additives were calcifying intestines and causing slow, agonizing deaths. The hurdle continues its brutal journey through Cheapside, past the market stalls where this baker once sold his poisoned loaves. Every baker in London is watching. The message is clear: cheat your customers, and this is your fate. But how did it come to this? How did bread, the staff of life, become a weapon of slow-motion murder? And why were medieval bakers willing to risk this humiliation for a few extra pennies? The answer lies in the economics of medieval grain, the desperation of urban poverty, and a regulatory system so draconian that it invented the baker's dozen, because selling 11 loaves instead of 12 could mean the pillory. By the time the hurdle reaches the Thames, the baker is barely conscious, covered in filth, rotting bread, and his own blood. But the punishment isn't over. The pillory awaits. London, 1266. A royal inspector breaks open a sack of flour in a Cheapside bakery. He runs his fingers through the powder, then touches his tongue. His face contorts. This isn't wheat. It's a toxic cocktail that's been poisoning England's capital for years. King Henry III had commissioned an investigation after physicians noticed something disturbing. London's poor were developing mysterious ailments. Their joints seized, their bellies distended. Some were literally hardening from the inside. The culprits were the city's bakers, members of one of London's most powerful guilds. They'd discovered a profitable secret. Customers couldn't taste small amounts of adulterants mixed into their daily bread. And bread was everything. In 13th century England, bread wasn't just food. It was 70% of the common person's diet. If you controlled the bread, you controlled survival itself, and London's bakers were exploiting that power with deadly efficiency. The fraud was systematic. Chalk dust was the favorite. It was white, plentiful, and added weight. A baker could stretch one sack of genuine wheat flour into 2 sacks of adulterated product, doubling his profit margin overnight. But chalk wasn't the only additive. Sawdust from nearby carpenter shops provided bulk. Ground bones from butcher waste added protein, or so bakers claimed. Some even used ground limestone, scraped from church walls. Here's what made this conspiracy so insidious. The effects weren't immediate. A customer eating adulterated bread wouldn't drop dead. They'd simply grow weaker, sicker, more brittle over months and years. The perfect crime, almost. The human body isn't designed to process chalk or sawdust. The calcium compounds would accumulate in soft tissues. Intestines became inflamed and scarred. Kidney stones formed. In children, growth became stunted. London was being slowly poisoned by its daily bread. King Henry's inspectors uncovered the full scale of the fraud when they raided bakeries across London. Nearly every establishment had hidden stores of adulterants. This wasn't a few bad actors. It was an industry-wide conspiracy of the Bakers' Guild itself. The bakers had a system. Junior apprentices did the mixing in back rooms before dawn. The adulterated flour was kept separate from the quality batches reserved for nobility and guild inspectors. 2 grades of bread, one for the rich, poison for the poor. One baker, when questioned under oath, admitted the practice was taught as standard apprentice training. A master who doesn't stretch his flour is a fool who'll die poor, his own teacher had told him. This was institutional corruption, passed down through generations. The king's rage was legendary. These weren't just thieves. They were murderers operating in plain sight, wrapped in the respectability of guild membership. Henry III would make an example so brutal that no baker would dare fraud again for centuries. What followed would become known as the poisoned bread laws, a series of punishments so severe and public that they'd reshape English food regulation forever. The Bakers' Guild was about to learn that some crimes, even the king himself wouldn't forgive. The Assize of Bread, enacted in 1266, wasn't just legislation. It was England's declaration of war against baker fraud. Every loaf's weight was now tied directly to grain prices by royal decree, creating history's first government-regulated food formula. Under King Henry III's new law, inspectors called ale-conners would prowl bakeries unannounced, carrying official scales and standardized weights. A single underweight loaf meant criminal charges. The punishment was deliberately theatrical. Convicted bakers were locked in wooden pillories erected in the town square, their heads and hands trapped, completely defenseless before the gathering crowd. But the true genius of medieval justice was this. The baker's own fraudulent loaves were piled at the pillory's base, and villagers were encouraged, no expected, to hurl them at the criminal's face. For hours, bakers would endure bombardment by their own products. Stale loaves became projectiles. The very bread that earned them illicit profit now became instruments of public humiliation. This wasn't just punishment, it was social theater. Every thrown loaf reinforced a message: cheat your neighbors, become entertainment. The spectacle turned consumer fraud into communal sport. Court records from 1270s London reveal bakers received between 3 hours to a full day in the pillory, depending on the severity of their fraud. Repeat offenders faced permanent exile from the guild. But underbaking, making loaves that looked full weight but contained excess air and moisture, became the most prosecuted offense. These loaves would shrink hours after sale, revealing the deception. Bakers learned to exploit oven temperatures, creating crusts that sealed in steam. The loaves passed initial inspection, but betrayed customers by nightfall when they deflated to half their morning size. The assize responded with mandatory cooling periods. Bakers had to display loaves for a full hour before sale, allowing inspectors to observe any shrinkage. The law was learning to outsmart the fraudsters. Here's where medieval law got truly obsessed. Different bread types had different legal weights: wastel bread, farthing bread, halfpenny bread, each with precise specifications tied to fluctuating wheat prices. When wheat prices rose, legal loaf weights decreased proportionally. Bakers were expected to do complex calculations daily, adjusting their recipes to match the assize tables posted at every market. This obsessive regulation created an entire enforcement bureaucracy. London alone employed dozens of bread inspectors, each receiving a portion of the fines collected from fraudulent bakers. The financial incentive was obvious. Inspectors became zealous hunters of bread fraud. Some historians argue this created its own corruption, with inspectors extorting bakers through threat of pillory. But for ordinary villagers, pillory day was entertainment. Records describe crowds of hundreds gathering to watch baker punishments, treating the spectacle like modern sporting events. Children were encouraged to participate, teaching them early that fraud had consequences. The pillory became multi-generational moral education, wrapped in public spectacle and sanctioned violence. Some bakers developed a grim solution to avoid the pillory entirely: the baker's dozen. Better to give 13 loaves for the price of 12 than risk even one being underweight. This mathematical insurance policy, the extra loaf, became industry standard. One underweight loaf in 12 meant pillory. One extra loaf meant survival. The baker's dozen was born from fear. By 1300, the Assize of Bread had transformed English baking from artisan craft to regulated industry. Every ounce was political. Every loaf was potential evidence. Medieval food law had arrived. But the most brutal punishments were reserved for those caught adding adulterants. Because some bakers weren't just underbaking, they were poisoning, and medieval justice saved its darkest theater for them. London, 1266. A baker named John Brid stands at the pillory, his neck and wrists locked in wood. Around his neck hangs the evidence: 11 loaves when he promised 12. The crowd doesn't throw rotten vegetables. They throw his own bread, hardened, accusatory projectiles that strike his face with each chant of cheat, cheat, cheat. This is the Assize of Bread in action. King Henry III's inspectors weighed every loaf sold in England. 1 ounce short, you faced the pillory. 2 ounces, mutilation. The math was brutal. Grain prices fluctuated daily, but the Assize fixed bread prices by law. Bakers couldn't raise prices, so they shrank loaves, and when caught, they paid in flesh. In 1277, Cambridge records show a baker lost his ear for selling underweight loaves. In Norwich, another was dragged through streets, a burnt loaf tied around his neck until the rope drew blood. But here's what the crown truly feared: bread riots. When bakers cheated, the poor starved, and starving peasants overthrew kingdoms. The punishment wasn't about justice, it was about terror. So bakers invented insurance, the baker's dozen. 13 loaves for every 12 ordered. That extra loaf was survival, a buffer against the scales, the inspectors, and the pillory. The practice spread like wildfire through guilds. Give 13, keep your ears became the unspoken motto. Better to lose profit than lose body parts. By 1300, the baker's dozen wasn't generosity. It was mathematical desperation. Every baker knew someone who'd miscounted. Every baker had seen the pillory filled. The wholesalers demanded it too. When middlemen bought from bakers, they'd weigh the entire batch. One short loaf meant the baker refunded everything and got reported. Court records overflow with baker prosecutions. In London alone, dozens faced punishment yearly. The Assize of Bread didn't just regulate commerce, it ruled through fear. And the irony? That 13th loaf born from terror became tradition. Centuries after the Assize ended, we still say baker's dozen. The punishment faded, the paranoia remained. Today, when you order 13 donuts and get that extra one, you're witnessing an echo of medieval England's most effective regulatory system. Legislate through mutilation, enforce through humiliation. The baker's dozen wasn't invented by generous bakers. It was born in the shadow of the pillory, calculated by men who'd rather give away bread than face London's crowds with loaves tied around their necks. The whiter your bread, the higher your status. Medieval Londoners didn't know they were eating poison. They thought they were eating privilege. But that brilliant white color didn't come from wheat. It came from alum, a chemical compound that bakers added to make cheap flour look expensive. Alum is an astringent. The same substance used to tan leather and dye fabric was being kneaded into the bread that fed London's population. When consumed regularly, alum wreaks havoc on the digestive system, causing severe stomach cramps, constipation, and in high doses, kidney damage. Then came the chalk. Ground limestone mixed into dough created weight and whiteness, two things customers paid premium prices for. But chalk doesn't digest, it accumulates. Medieval bodies were slowly calcifying from the inside as calcium deposits built up in organs and intestines. The symptoms were everywhere but poorly understood. Chronic constipation, kidney stones, abdominal masses. Physicians blamed bad humors. The real culprit was dinner. Here's the twisted irony. The poor ate dark bread made from whole grain and bean flour. It was coarse and looked inferior, but it wasn't poisoning them. The wealthy ate pure white bread daily, paying triple the price for what they believed was superior quality. They were actually purchasing a faster death. And bakers knew. Account books from the period show deliberate calculations, just enough adulterant to boost profit, not so much the customer dies immediately. Some bakers added bone meal from graveyards. Others used ground peas and beans. The most brazen used sawdust, wood pulp passing for grain. This wasn't ignorance. This was a calculated business model that treated human bodies as acceptable collateral damage for profit margins. By the 1260s, London's population was experiencing what we'd now recognize as a mass poisoning event. But it happened slow enough that no one made the connection. Until King Henry III's own physicians started noticing patterns, wealthy patients suffering identical symptoms, all heavy consumers of premium white bread. The medical establishment of 1266 was about to collide with London's baking industry. And when the king's inspectors raided the first bakery, what they found was apocalyptic. 6 centuries after Henry III dragged cheating bakers through London streets, Victorian England faced the exact same crisis. But this time, the poison was far deadlier. In 1850s London, bread glowed unnaturally white. Bakers had discovered that chalk and sawdust were amateur tricks. They'd upgraded to alum and bone ash to bleach their flour. Some added copper sulfate for color, others mixed in plaster of Paris for weight. The poor were being systematically poisoned by their daily bread. Then came Arthur Hill Hassall, a physician with a microscope and a mission. What he discovered in London's bread would shock the nation. The medieval Assize of Bread had long been forgotten. Without enforcement, bakers reverted to their ancestral crimes, but with industrial-age chemicals. Here's the dark irony. Those medieval laws that seemed barbaric, they'd been protecting consumers for 600 years. When they disappeared, the poisoning resumed immediately. Hassall published his findings in The Lancet. The scandal erupted. Parliament was forced to act. The 1860 Food Adulteration Act became Britain's first modern food safety law. It was essentially the Assize of Bread reborn for the industrial age. Same crime, same solution, 6 centuries later. The bakers hadn't changed, only the chemicals had. Today's ingredient labels, food inspectors, and safety regulations are direct descendants of those medieval bread laws. Henry III's brutal enforcement started something that never ended. The FDA, food standards agencies worldwide, mandatory labeling, all trace their lineage back to those London bakers dragged through streets by burnt loaves in 1266. And the baker's dozen, still practiced today. That 13th loaf, added from pure fear of punishment, became a symbol of honest trade that outlasted empires. The medieval solution was brutal, but it worked. Those bakers in pillories, pelted with their own fraudulent bread, sent a message that echoed through centuries. Every time you check a food label or trust that bread won't poison you, you're benefiting from a system born in medieval brutality and public humiliation. History's lesson is clear. Without enforcement, food suppliers will always be tempted to cheat. The Victorians learned this the hard way, 600 years too late. From chalk dust to alum to today's food scandals, the game remains the same. Only constant vigilance keeps poison out of our daily bread. Those medieval bakers, dragged through streets with loaves around their necks, would recognize our world, because the fight for safe food never really ended. It just got better at regulations. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out other videos.